There are moments in a person's life that arrive without announcement, without ceremony, without even the courtesy of a warning. They do not knock. They do not wait. They simply appear, tucked inside ordinary days that look like every other ordinary day before them, disguised as small decisions that feel, in the moment, like nothing at all. Mara Elissen would later say that the most important day of her life began with a cup of cold coffee, a leaking faucet she couldn't afford to fix, and a phone call she almost didn't answer. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of morning where the sky can't decide between rain and resignation and settles for both at once. Mara stood at the kitchen sink in the small rental house she shared with her 2 daughters, holding a mug that had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't moved, not because she was peaceful or contemplative or lost in some beautiful thought. She hadn't moved because she was exhausted in the way that only certain kinds of people understand, the exhaustion that doesn't come from a single sleepless night, but from years of sleepless nights stacked end to end, years of stretching every dollar past the point it was designed to go, years of telling her daughters that everything would be fine in the tone that children recognize immediately and pretend to believe anyway, because they love you and don't want you to feel alone in your fear. Her oldest, Petra, was 11, old enough to notice things, old enough to keep quiet about what she noticed. Her youngest, Dani, had just turned 7, and she still believed that her mother could fix anything, which was both the greatest gift and the heaviest burden Mara had ever carried. The faucet dripped. It had been dripping for 3 weeks. The landlord had promised twice to come. She had stopped believing promises made by people who didn't have to live with the consequences of breaking them. She worked the afternoon shift at a medical billing office 40 minutes away by bus. The work was not glamorous and not particularly well paid, but it was steady, and steady was the most precious thing in her world. She had a second job on weekends, helping catalog inventory at a second-hand furniture warehouse, which paid cash and didn't judge her for showing up tired. Between the 2 jobs, she made just enough to cover rent, utilities, groceries, and the girls' school expenses, with nothing left over for savings, for emergencies, fodder for the kinds of small luxuries that make a person feel like a human being rather than a system for surviving. She had not always lived like this. There had been a time, not so long ago, and yet impossibly distant, when she had been a different version of herself, a version that laughed more freely, that made plans without calculating risk, that believed the future was a place she was moving toward rather than a wall she was being pressed against. She had been married. She had been hopeful. She had believed in the story she was building. Then the story changed without asking her permission. Her husband left, quietly at first, and then completely. And the life she had constructed around a shared future fell apart in a way that taught her something she wished she didn't know. That the distance between stability and crisis is far smaller than anyone wants to believe. She had done everything right, or tried to. She had found work. She had found a place to live. She had built a routine tight enough to hold them together. But the world had a talent for finding the hairline cracks in whatever you built, and hers were showing. The phone rang at 7:43 in the morning. She looked at the screen. It was a number she recognized, but hadn't seen in almost 2 years. It belonged to her cousin Rolf, and she almost put it down. She and Rolf had not spoken warmly since the last time the family had gathered, which had ended the way family gatherings often ended, time with old grievances resurfacing, and too many people speaking at once, and nobody listening. But something made her answer. She would think about that later, about the small, inexplicable pull that made her pick up instead of letting it ring. Mara. His voice was formal in the way voices get when someone is delivering information they consider important. Your Uncle Bernard passed away 4 days ago. I thought you should know. She stood very still. Bernard, her mother's brother. She had not seen him in years, not since her mother's own funeral, when he had sat in the back row and wept quietly and left without speaking to anyone. He had always been a solitary man, brilliant in the particular, obsessive way that some people are brilliant, a collector, a researcher, and someone who moved through the world as if it were a library, and he was the only one who understood how to read it. He had no wife, no children. He had a house in the northern part of the state, filled floor to ceiling with the objects he had spent his life accumulating, books and maps and instruments and antiques and curiosities of every kind. He had traveled widely, worked obscurely in fields that nobody in the family fully understood, and then come home to his house on the hill and filled it with the evidence of everywhere he had been. She had liked him, she realized, standing at her kitchen sink. She had liked him in the quiet way you like a person who never demands anything from you, who appears at intervals in your life like a lighthouse seen briefly through fog, consistent and self-contained. She had not known him well. She had not tried hard enough to know him well, and that recognition settled in her chest with a dull weight. Was it peaceful? She asked. He went in his sleep, Rolf said. Then, without pausing, there's going to be a meeting about the estate. The lawyer is handling it, but family members need to be present. I'm calling because you're on the list. She was on the list. She let that sit for a moment. When? She asked. Saturday, 11 in the morning, at the house. She wrote down the address, though she already knew it. She had been there once, as a child, and the memory had never fully left her. A large stone house surrounded by old trees, the kind of house that looks as if it grew out of the ground rather than being built upon it. Dark inside, always dark, like every window covered by shelves or curtains, or the weight of things stacked against the glass. She went back to work that morning carrying the news inside her like a stone in her pocket. She did not yet allow herself to think about what it might mean. She knew better than to hope. Her life had taught her that hope without foundation was just a faster way to fall. Saturday came gray and cold. She arranged for a neighbor to watch the girls and took the first bus north at 7:30, switching twice, arriving at the house on the hill at 10:50 with damp shoes and a coat that wasn't quite warm enough. She stood at the end of the gravel path for a moment and looked at the house. It was exactly as she remembered it, and also somehow more than she remembered. Larger, more solemn, more present, as if the death of its owner had given it a kind of dignity it hadn't needed to assert while he was alive. Inside, the house was crowded in a way she hadn't expected. She had known there would be family members. She had not known there would be this many of them. Her cousin Rolf was there with his wife and his brother Henrik, both of them standing near the fireplace, with the ease of men who had already decided the outcome of the day. Her Aunt Signe, Bernard's surviving sister and her mother's oldest sibling, sat in an armchair near the window with the expression of a woman who intended to remain seated until the world arranged itself correctly. There were other cousins she recognized only vaguely, the kind of relatives who appear at weddings and funerals and estate meetings and nowhere else. A lawyer sat at the large table in the center of the room, with papers arranged before him in the careful geometry of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Mara took a seat near the back. No one made space for her near the front. She was used to that. The lawyer read the will with the measured pace of a man who understood that words, delivered at the right speed, carry more weight. Bernard had, over the course of his life, accumulated more than anyone in the room had anticipated. Not in liquid assets, the lawyer was careful to clarify, but in property and contents, the house itself, the land around it, the collections inside. It was when a professional appraiser had made a preliminary pass through the rooms, estimated to be worth a significant sum. Not a fortune in the way some people use that word, but enough. More than enough for the people in this room who had been watching the numbers with the intensity of people who needed them badly. The house would go to auction, the will directed, with proceeds split according to a formula that allocated shares based on degree of relation and specific bequests. Several items had been designated directly. Bernard had been specific about a few things. The piano in the East Room was to go to Henrik, who had once admired it. A set of maritime charts was to go to a research institution named in the document. His personal correspondence files were to go to the university library. And then the lawyer looked up. "There is one additional bequest," he said, "made by amendment to the will, on signed and witnessed 14 months ago." He paused in the way lawyers pause when they want the next sentence to arrive with appropriate gravity. The item described as the Elissen writing desk, an antique walnut secretary desk, approximately 140 years of age, currently located in the study on the second floor, is bequeathed directly and entirely to Mara Elissen. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then it was not quiet at all. She heard her name being said in several different tones. She heard Henrik's voice, sharp and disbelieving. She heard Rolf say something under his breath to his wife. She heard her Aunt Sina make a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough to feel like one. She heard the word desk spoken several times, each repetition carrying a slightly different shade of incredulity. The lawyer clarified, as though clarification were needed, that the desk was the only item bequeathed directly to Mara. The rest of the estate would be processed and distributed according to the formula. No cash, no property, no share in the auction proceeds, only the desk. Mara sat very still in her chair near the back of the room. She was aware of eyes on her. She was aware of the particular quality of attention that people give when they are deciding whether to feel sorry for someone or simply superior to them. She had felt that quality of attention before in her life, at school, when her clothes weren't right, at her husband's family's holiday gatherings, when she understood she was being assessed and found insufficient, at the medical billing office, when she had made an error and been spoken to in front of the others. She had learned, and over years of practice, to meet it with a face that gave nothing away. "Could I see it?" she asked, addressing the lawyer. He nodded. "The house will be accessible for item retrieval for the next 3 days. You may come at any time during that window." She nodded back. Simple as that. On the walk to the bus stop afterward, she could hear the voices of her cousins drifting from the house. She didn't need to make out the words. The tone was enough. She had taken the worthless one. She had driven 4 hours round trip on 2 buses on a Saturday morning and come away with an old piece of furniture, while everyone else was calculating their shares of a substantial estate. She imagined how the story would circulate at the next family gathering, if she was invited to the next one, which she doubted. Poor Mara, always the last to know and the last to benefit. Took a dusty old desk and thought it was a gift. She sat at the bus stop and thought about Bernard, about the fact that he had amended his will 14 months ago and chosen her name, specifically her name, not Rolf's, not Henrik's, not Signa's, but hers. She thought about the man she hadn't known well enough, about the lighthouse in the fog, about the way he had wept at her mother's funeral and left without speaking. She thought, he knew something I don't. She didn't know where the thought came from, but it arrived fully formed, certain and quiet, and she held it the whole way home. She told herself not to read meaning into the actions of a dead man. She told herself that old people made strange decisions, that sentiment was not the same as strategy, that a 14-month-old amendment to a will might just be the act of a lonely man who had remembered a niece he hadn't seen in years and wanted to give her something personal, something that had once belonged to the family before it became his. But she kept thinking about the way he had lived, about the precision with which he had arranged his life. Bernard Elissen had not been a sentimental man. He had been an organized one, meticulous, every collection catalogued, every item in its place with purpose. He was not the kind of man who gave things away casually. She went back on Monday, alone. The house was quieter than it had been on Saturday. Most of the cousins had already come and gone, retrieving what they'd been permitted to take, or simply walking the rooms, in the way people do when they are evaluating the worth of things that aren't yet theirs. The lawyer's assistant, a young woman named Clea, met Mara at the door with a clipboard and a polite professional sympathy that made Mara feel briefly, absurdly grateful. "The study is on the second floor," Clea said. "Second door on the left. I'll be downstairs if you need anything." Mara climbed the stairs alone. The house smelled of old wood and cold air, and the particular combination of paper and time that accumulates in places where someone has spent decades reading. The walls of the staircase were lined with framed prints, botanical illustrations mostly, detailed and precise, the kind you find in scientific journals from the 19th century. She paused on the third step to look at one, a cross-section of a nautilus shell, every chamber numbered. Beneath it, in small, neat handwriting that she recognized from birthday cards she had received as a child, Bernard had written a single word directly on the wall. Patience. She stood looking at it for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she continued up. The study was a room that made her breath catch slightly when she first stepped into it. She had expected clutter. Bernard had been known for clutter, for the productive disorder of a mind that moved faster than its surroundings could be organized. What she found instead was a room of extraordinary discipline, every shelf labeled, every surface clear. Books arranged not by spine color or decorative preference, but by subject, and within subject by date, and within date by format. Maps in flat drawers, instruments in glass cases, everything attended to with a care that communicated something important about the person who had arranged it. At the far end of the room, beneath a window that looked out over the old trees, sat the desk. She had expected something small. When she thought of antique desks, she thought of the delicate little writing surfaces she had seen in old movies, the spindly-legged things that looked good in a period drama and would collapse under any serious use. This was not that. This was large, imposing, built from a walnut so dark it was almost black, with a timbre front that had been rolled up to reveal the interior compartments. It stood on 4 thick legs, solid and permanent, the kind of furniture that has been somewhere long enough to stop being furniture and become architecture. And 2 wide drawers flanked the base, their brass pulls worn smooth by decades of use. The desktop itself was inlaid with faded green leather, cracked at the corners, annotated with the invisible marks of countless hours of work. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment, simply looking at it. It was beautiful, she thought. Not in a decorative way, not in the way that objects are beautiful when they are designed to be looked at. It was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they were made to last, when someone built them with the expectation that they would outlive their builder by 100 years, and they did. She walked toward it slowly. The floorboards, old and loose, announced each step. She reached out and rested her hand on the top of the timbre front, feeling the ridges of the wooden slats beneath her palm. The wood was cool and smooth. She ran her fingers along the brass pulls of the upper compartments, small, narrow drawers behind the tambour, a dozen of them, each one about the size of a brick. She tried one. It slid open without resistance. Empty, lined with a deep green velvet that had faded unevenly. She tried another. Also empty, also lined, also bearing the faint impressions of things that had once rested there. The whole interior smelled of him, she realized, of cedar and old paper and something else she couldn't name, some specific chemical compound that she associated purely with Bernard and had not smelled since she was a child, sitting in his living room watching him work. She opened the main drawers. The upper left held a set of precision instruments, small brass calipers, a loop, a measuring gauge of some kind. Or the upper right held a stack of index cards bound with a rubber band, each one covered in that same neat handwriting. She lifted the stack and looked at the top card. It held a series of numbers and abbreviations she didn't recognize. Not random, clearly organized according to some system, but encoded in a language she didn't have the key for. She set it down carefully. The lower drawers held rolled papers. Architectural drawings, she thought at first. Then she unrolled one slightly and realized they were maps. Detailed, hand-annotated maps of what appeared to be estate properties, each one marked with measurements and notations in multiple colors of ink. She rolled it back up and returned it to the drawer. She sat in the chair behind the desk. It was a deep chair, leather, cracked in the same places as the desk's surface, and it received her weight with the solidity of a thing that had been sat in by someone much larger for many years. She sat for a moment with her hands on the desk's surface, looking at the room from the angle that Bernard had looked at it for decades. What did you know? She thought. What were you trying to tell me? She was not a superstitious person. She did not believe in signs or messages from the dead or the idea that the universe arranged itself around human wishes. She believed in work and patience and the slow accumulation of what you could carry. But she sat in that chair in that room and felt with a certainty she could not explain that she had not come here to collect a piece of furniture. She had come here because something was waiting. She pulled open the upper left drawer again, the one with the instruments, and took out the loop. She held it to her eye and examined the interior of the tambour compartment she had opened first. The velvet lining was intact. She ran the tip of her finger along the back wall of the compartment and felt it, just barely, a seam. A line where the velvet met something beneath it at an angle slightly different from the angle of the compartment itself. She pressed gently. Nothing. She pressed at a different point along the seam, to the left. Nothing. Then, at the upper right corner of the seam, the pressure met a resistance that was fractionally different from wood, something mechanical, something designed. She held her breath. She pressed again, more firmly, at exactly that corner. A soft click moved through the desk like a whisper. She sat back in the chair and stared at the interior of the compartment. Nothing had changed that she could see, but the quality of the silence in the room had shifted, the way the quality of silence shifts when something has just happened that matters, when the world has rearranged itself by a single degree. She pressed the corner again. Again, the click. She looked at the velvet lining more carefully. At the base of the compartment, a thin horizontal line was visible now that had not been visible before, so thin it was nearly invisible. But it ran all the way across the bottom from one side to the other, perfectly straight. Too straight to be a crack. She pressed gently on the base of the compartment, fingers flat. It moved. Not much. Less than a centimeter. But it moved, rotating forward on a hidden hinge, and behind it, where there should have been nothing but the back panel of a small drawer, there was a gap, dark, narrow, and clearly deeper than the drawer had any right to be. She stared at it. Her heart was beating in a way that reminded her she had a heart. She did not reach in. Not yet. She sat with the open gap in front of her, and thought about the nautilus print on the staircase wall, about the word written beneath it in her uncle's careful hand. Patience. She thought about the index cards with their encoded notations. She thought about a man who had traveled widely and worked obscurely, and come home to fill a house with the careful, deliberate evidence of a life spent paying attention. She thought about the fact that he had amended his will 14 months ago and chosen her name. She sat for another full minute, simply breathing. Then she reached in. The space behind the false base was perhaps 4 inches deep and ran the full width of the compartment, about a foot across. Her fingers found the contents immediately, not scattered, not loose, but arranged, bundled, organized with the same precision that defined every other surface in this room. She drew out the first bundle and held it under the light from the window. It was a set of documents, held together with a clip of aged metal, the kind of spring clip she associated with old-fashioned filing systems. The paper was thick and cream-colored and had the unmistakable texture of formal legal documents printed on heavy stock. She lifted the clip and looked at the top sheet. It was a certificate, a numbered certificate, issued by an institution she recognized, a major Swiss bank, in a format she had seen in documentaries about rare assets and fine art and high-value collectibles. The kind of certificate issued not as currency, but as title, as proof of ownership over something that could not simply be transferred in a transaction, but required documentation of provenance, authentication, and value. She read the description on the certificate twice. Then she read it a third time, slowly, word by word, the way you read something when you cannot trust the first reading. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady, steadier than she expected them to be. A strange calm had settled over her, the calm of a person standing at the edge of something so large she couldn't yet see its full dimensions, and so could not yet react to them. She was standing at the edge, looking in, and the bottom was not visible. She set the first certificate carefully on the desk surface and reached into the gap again. There were more. A second bundle, thicker than the first. A third. A fourth, wrapped in a thin protective sleeve of archival material, sealed at the edges with a strip of acid-free tape, bearing a small label in Bernard's handwriting. The label read, "For Mara, with everything I should have said." She did not open that one yet. She sat with the 4 bundles arranged before her on the faded green leather of the desktop and the gray October light coming through the window over the old trees. And she thought about her daughters, and the dripping faucet, and the 2 buses in each direction, and the cold coffee she had not finished that Tuesday morning. She thought about the look on Henrik's face when the lawyer had said her name. She thought about patience, about what it cost, and what it was for. She picked up the first certificate again and read the value noted at the bottom of the document in the clean, specific language of institutional authentication. The number had 9 digits. She set it down. She pressed her palms flat against the desk's surface and looked straight ahead at the room that Bernard had built, the labeled shelves and the careful maps and the instruments in their glass cases and the books arranged by date within subject. She looked at all the evidence of a life spent paying attention to the things that mattered, building something over decades with the unhurried patience of a man who knew he was building for more than himself. She did not cry. She was not, in that moment, capable of crying. She was too still for that, and too suspended in the gap between what she had been and what the next moment was going to require her to become. She reached for the bundle labeled "For Mara" and began, very slowly, to open it. Outside, the old trees moved in the cold wind, and somewhere below her in the house, a clock she hadn't noticed before marked the hour with a sound that seemed to come from a great distance, patient and unhurried, like something that had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment to arrive. She had come here expecting nothing. She had told herself to expect nothing. She had built a life on the discipline of expecting nothing, of working with what was available and not reaching for what wasn't, of closing her hands around the certain and releasing the possible before it could hurt her. But Bernard had known something about her that she had forgotten about herself. He had known she would keep looking. He had known she would press the right corner at the right moment and hold steady when something moved. He had known she was the one, out of all of them, who would come to this room with patience instead of appetite, who would sit in the chair and think before she reached, who would not grab and run but would stay and understand. He had known. And now the documents were in front of her, and the number was still there when she looked at it again. 9 digits, and the archive sleeve was open, and her uncle's handwriting was on the first page of the letter inside, and the room smelled of him, and of time, and of everything that had been waiting here quietly while the world went about its business outside the window. She began to read. The letter was 4 pages long, written on the same cream-colored heavy stock as the certificates in Bernard's handwriting, which she now recognized as the most careful thing she had ever seen committed to paper. Each letter formed with the unhurried precision of a man who wrote as he thought, slowly, with full attention, without crossing things out. There were no corrections anywhere on the 4 pages. He had composed it completely before he began to write it down. She read it straight through once without stopping. Then she set it on the desk beside the certificates and stared at the window for a long time. Outside, the old trees moved. The clock downstairs counted another quarter hour. Then she read it again. He began with an apology, which surprised her. Bernard Elissen had not been a man she associated with apology. He apologized for the distance he had kept, from her mother in the years before her mother's death, from the family in general. He explained it in a way that was not making excuses, but was trying to be honest about something that had cost him. He had not been good at people. He had been good at objects, at systems, at the patient work of understanding how things were made and what they were worth. People required a different kind of patience, a patience for uncertainty and unpredictability, and the frustrating refusal of human beings to behave according to any logical system. And he had spent most of his life choosing the objects over the people, and had arrived at the end of that life, knowing it had been a choice, and not simply a temperament. He wrote about her mother. He wrote about the specific quality of her laugh, which Mara had forgotten, and now, reading about it, suddenly remembered with an almost physical shock, the way it was a little too loud for polite company, the way it arrived without warning and filled a room like something escaped from somewhere wonderful. He wrote that her mother had been the best person in the family, which Mara had always privately believed and had never heard confirmed by anyone in a position to compare. Then he wrote about the desk. He had acquired it, he explained, 43 years ago, from an estate sale in a small city in the south of France. The estate had belonged to a man named Gustave Armand Pelletier, who had died at the age of 91 without immediate heirs, and whose house had been sold off piece by piece over the course of a long weekend in October. Bernard had been there on research for a project he was working on at the time, cataloging the dispersal of certain significant private collections in the post-war period. He had not intended to buy anything. He had been there to observe, to document, to record what was going where. But the desk had stopped him. It was not the desk itself exactly, though the desk was extraordinary, crafted by a documented maker in Paris in the 1880s, one of a small number of pieces attributed to a workshop that had operated for less than a decade before its master craftsman died and his apprentices scattered. What stopped Bernard was not the desk, but what he noticed about the desk. The way the interior compartments were set approximately 4 centimeters shallower than the exterior dimensions of the piece should have allowed. He had measured it twice, standing in the crowded, chaotic atmosphere of the estate sale, pulling his calipers from his pocket and running them along surfaces, while an auctioneer barked prices in the background. The mathematics was incontrovertible. There was space inside the desk that was not accounted for by any visible compartment. He bought it for 600 francs, which was not nothing in 1979. But wasn't, he wrote, what it would have cost him if anyone else in that room had owned a pair of calipers and a reason to use them. He brought it home. He spent 3 months with it before he found the mechanism, 3 months of measurement and careful mapping, and the kind of patient, systematic investigation that he was built for and that most people lacked the temperament to sustain. When he finally found the release point, the corner in the upper right, and pressed it, and heard the click, and watched the false base rotate forward on its hidden hinge, what he found behind it stopped him in a way that very few things in his long, carefully examined life had stopped him. He described what he found with the precision of a man filing a report, methodical and specific, without emotional coloring, though the emotion was there between the sentences if you knew where to look. He had found, in the hidden space behind the false base of the upper left timbre compartment, a collection of documents that had been placed there no later than 1943. Based on the dates printed and handwritten on the papers themselves, should documents that represented, in the language of the specialized market to which they belonged, one of the most significant undiscovered private collections of its kind in the post-war inventory of displaced cultural property. Mara had to read that sentence twice, then a third time. She looked at the bundles on the desk beside the letter, and then she looked back at the letter, and she kept reading. Bernard had spent the following 27 years determining exactly what he had found. This was not because he was slow. It was because the work required to properly understand and authenticate what the documents represented was the work of decades, not months, and because he was doing it alone, without institutional support, without colleagues who could be trusted with information this sensitive, in a field where the provenance of displaced cultural property carried legal and ethical dimensions that required careful, thorough handling before any disclosure was possible. The documents in the hidden compartment were, he wrote, certificates of ownership, provenance records, and authenticated appraisal documents relating to a private collection of rare postage stamps, a collection assembled over a period of approximately 60 years by a family in Lyon who had hidden it piece by piece in the years immediately preceding and during the Second World War, distributing the documentation across multiple secure locations as insurance against loss. The collection itself, he explained, had not been hidden in the desk. The collection had been hidden elsewhere, in a location documented in the papers he had found, in a sealed archive container deposited in a private vault in Geneva under a numbered account, access to which required the certificates he now held and which had been maintained in continuous storage since 1944 through a standing instruction attached to a separately funded account, paid forward in a lump sum at the time of deposit, calculated to cover 80 years of fees. Mara set the letter down. She looked at the certificates. She picked up the letter again. The 80-year term, Bernard wrote, had not yet expired. The vault and its contents remained intact, maintained, and accessible to the holder of the relevant certificates. He had verified this as recently as 14 months ago, when he had traveled to Geneva for what he described, in his dry and precise way, as a routine confirmation visit. He had not accessed the vault. He had only confirmed its status, presented his credentials as the current holder of the certificates, and received written confirmation that the collection remained in storage and in the condition documented at the time of deposit. The collection, based on the authenticated appraisals attached to the original documents and updated by an independent valuation he had commissioned privately 18 months earlier, was worth, at current market estimates, between $280 and $310 million. The number sat in the letter in Bernard's calm handwriting, surrounded by the same careful sentences as everything else, as if it were simply the next piece of information in a sequence, and as if it were no more remarkable than the measurements of the desk's interior compartments or the price he had paid at the estate sale in France in 1979. $280 to $310 million. Mara put the letter down on the desk. She put it down carefully, because her hands had begun to shake, not violently, not dramatically, but in the fine, involuntary way that hands shake when the body understands something before the mind has fully caught up to it. She pressed her palms flat against the green leather and felt the cool of the surface and the solidity of the walnut beneath it, and breathed. She breathed for a long time. The clock downstairs marked another quarter hour. She thought about the bus ride, the 2 transfers, the cold shoes on the wet gravel. She thought about Henrik standing at the fireplace with his brother, easy and certain. She thought about her Aunt Signa in the armchair, with her expression of settled superiority. She thought about the sound of her own name in the lawyer's mouth and the particular silence that had followed it, and then the particular noise. She thought about the dripping faucet. She thought about Petra, who was 11 and old enough to notice things, and had been noticing for years that her mother carried something heavy and never put it down. She thought about Donnie, who was 7 and still believed her mother could fix anything. She picked up the letter and read the last page. Bernard wrote that he had chosen her for specific reasons, which he listed in his methodical way, not to flatter her, but because he wanted her to understand the decision was not random or sentimental, though it was also, he admitted, a little sentimental. He had chosen her because she was her mother's daughter, and her mother had been the kind of person who understood that the value of a thing was not always visible from the outside. He had chosen her because he had watched her, from the careful distance he kept from everyone, build a life on honesty and patience, under conditions that would have broken many people. And he believed that a person who could do that, with nothing, could do something extraordinary with something. He had chosen her because the others would have immediately sold the certificates without understanding what they had, would have moved too fast and too loudly, and attracted exactly the wrong kind of attention in a field where quiet and careful handling was the difference between realizing the full value and losing most of it to error and exposure. He had chosen her because she was the only one who would come to this room and sit in the chair and think before she reached. He wrote, "I am sorry I did not know you better. I think I would have liked to. I think your mother would be very pleased with you, and I know you don't hear that enough." Then he wrote the name of the lawyer in Geneva, the firm that held the account documentation, the reference number for the vault, and a set of specific instructions for how to proceed. He wrote that the process, done correctly, would take between 6 and 9 months from initial contact to full resolution, and that she should not hurry it, because hurrying it would cost her. He wrote the name of an authentication specialist in New York, and a legal firm in Geneva, and a second legal firm in London that specialized in cultural property and provenance cases. He wrote that she would need all 3, and that he had already written to each of them 14 months ago informing them that a holder of the certificates would be contacting them in due course, and that they were expecting her. He had arranged everything. He had laid out the path as carefully as he had laid out his collections, labeled and ordered, and accessible to someone with the patience to follow it. He had cleared the way 14 months ago, which meant he had known 14 months ago that he was running out of time. And he had spent that time not in fear or regret, but in preparation. For her. She folded the letter along its original creases and placed it back in the archival sleeve. She gathered the certificates and their bundles with great care and placed them in her bag, wrapping them first in her spare sweater because it was the best protective material she had with her. She took out her phone and photographed the interior of the hidden compartment from 3 different angles, and then the desk itself from multiple perspectives, and then the room, a methodical documentation that she had not planned, but that felt correct, felt like the right way to begin. She stood up from the chair. She stood with her bag over her shoulder and looked at the desk for a long moment. at the walnut so dark it was almost black, at the worn brass pulls, at the cracked green leather of the surface. "Thank you," she said. She was not sure whether she was speaking to the desk, or to Bernard, or to some version of her own mother, who might be in some way responsible for this improbable chain of events. She said it anyway. It seemed important to say it. She went downstairs and found Clea at the table with her clipboard. She told Clea she would need to arrange for the desk to be moved to storage, not immediately within the 3-day window. Clea noted it without comment. Mara walked out the front door, down the gravel path, and through the gate, and she stood on the road outside and looked up at the sky, which was still gray, still somewhere between rain and resignation. She stood there for a little while, just breathing the cold air. Then she walked to the bus stop and went home, and she did not tell anyone. Not that day, not for the following week. She had the documents, she had the letter, she had the photographs. She read Bernard's instructions 3 more times until she had memorized them. She researched each of the names he had given her, the lawyers, the authentication specialist, the Geneva firm, and found that they were exactly what he had described them as: real, established, respected in their fields. She found no reason to doubt any of it, and every reason to proceed with exactly the kind of unhurried care he had asked for. She called the Geneva firm first, a Thursday afternoon, stepping outside during her lunch break at the billing office. She gave the reference number Bernard had provided. There was a pause on the line, the sound of a search being conducted. Then the woman who had answered transferred her, not without explanation, to someone more senior. The more senior voice was warm and specific and confirmed, within the first 90 seconds of the call, that the account she was referencing was active, that the storage arrangement was current and in good standing, and that the firm had been in correspondence with a Bernard Elissen regarding the expected transfer of certificate custody, and that they were prepared to assist the new holder in initiating the process. She sat down on a bench outside the billing office with the phone against her ear and the cold October air on her face, and listened to the details, taking notes on the back of a receipt she pulled from her pocket. When she ended the call, she sat for another minute. A pigeon landed on the pavement near her feet and examined her with the professional disinterest of a city bird that has decided humans are primarily useful as sources of dropped food and otherwise irrelevant. She looked at it. It looked at her. She almost laughed. Almost. She called the New York specialist the following week. His name was Dr. Callum Marsh, and he had been in the field of rare philatelic authentication for 31 years. He answered the phone himself, which surprised her. And when she gave the reference number and mentioned Bernard's name, the quality of his attention changed in a way she could hear even over the phone. A sharpening, a focusing, the particular alertness of a person who has been waiting for a specific call. "Mr. Elissen told me it might be several years," Dr. Marsh said. "I'm glad it wasn't longer. How are you holding up?" The question surprised her. She said she was fine, which was approximately true. He explained the authentication process as it would apply to the documents she held. The certificates themselves would need to be examined physically, verified against records held in several institutional archives, cross-referenced with the provenance documentation he had on file from Bernard's earlier consultations. The vault contents in Geneva would need to be inspected and catalogued by a qualified specialist, which he was prepared to do in conjunction with the Swiss firm. He estimated the full authentication process, done properly and without shortcuts, would take approximately 4 months before a formal valuation could be issued. 4 months, she thought. She had been managing crisis timelines of 4 hours. 4 months felt like a gift. She took 3 days off from the billing office the following month, explaining it as a family matter, which it was, and flew to Geneva. She had not been on a plane in 11 years. The girl stayed with her neighbor, who asked no questions, and received a promise of dinner in return, which Mara intended to keep even if it took her until the new year. The Swiss firm was housed in a building that managed to be simultaneously modest from the outside and entirely overwhelming from the inside, the particular architecture of serious money, which did not need to announce itself with marble lobbies, and instead announced itself with the quality of silence in its corridors. She met with a senior partner named Herr Baumgartner, who had the bearing of a man who had handled sensitive matters for a very long time and had never once discussed them at a dinner party. He reviewed her documents with the impersonal thoroughness of someone for whom the sum attached to them was simply a number among other numbers. He explained the process for transferring certificate custody, the legal steps required under Swiss law, the timeline, the fees. He was precise and professional and treated her, she noticed with a quiet gratitude, entirely as a principal in the matter rather than as someone who might need to be explained to. Before she left on the second day, he walked her to the vault facility. Not inside, that would come after authentication was complete, but to the entrance, a set of heavy doors in a basement level 2 floors below the main building. He stood beside her at those doors and said, in his measured way, "The collection has been in undisturbed storage for 80 years. It is, by any measure, extraordinary that it survived intact. Many collections of this period did not." She looked at the doors. Behind them, in a sealed container that had been waiting since 1944, was the organized, documented evidence of a family who had loved beautiful things enough to hide them rather than let the world devour them, who had been careful enough and foresighted enough to distribute the proof of their ownership across multiple locations, who had paid forward 80 years of storage fees because they understood that beauty sometimes requires a very long patience. She thought, "I understand that." The authentication process ran its course over the following months, each step advancing according to Bernard's laid-out timeline with the satisfying regularity of a plan made by someone who understood the system he was navigating. Dr. Marsh flew to Geneva in the second month and spent 4 days cataloging the collection's contents against the original documentation. He called her the evening of the 4th day. "I need you to understand," he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, something that, in a more expressive person, might have been excitement, but in him came out as a very precise emphasis, that what your uncle found in that desk and what this collection represents is exceptional. Not exceptional by the standard of private collections I see regularly, exceptional by any standard. The assembly represents decades of knowledge and resources deployed by people who understood exactly what they were building. Several of the items in this collection are, to my knowledge, unique. There is nothing else like them in any public or private inventory that I am aware of." She was sitting at the kitchen table when he said this. The girls were in bed. The faucet had stopped dripping, fixed finally by the landlord after a 4th complaint. The house was quiet. "What does that mean for the valuation?" she asked. He told her. He gave her a range that was consistent with what Bernard had written in the letter, and then he told her that his own assessment, based on what he had seen in the vault, was that Bernard's estimate had been conservative. "The current market for items of this rarity and this provenance," he said, placed the high end of the range considerably above the figure her uncle had cited. She wrote the number on a piece of paper. She looked at it for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in the same drawer where she kept the girls' school records and her own work documents, the drawer that held all the things that mattered too much to lose. She did not tell the family anything during this period. There had been no expectation that she would, no relationship of trust to maintain, no obligation. The estate had been distributed and closed. The desk was in storage, legally hers. The contents of the desk were legally hers. The process she was engaged in was entirely her own business, conducted by professionals who were paid to maintain confidentiality, and did so without exception. But information of this magnitude, she discovered, has a way of creating pressure simply by existing. She carried it every day, on the bus to the billing office, at the second-hand furniture warehouse on weekends, at the school pickup and the grocery store, and the kitchen table in the evenings. She carried the knowledge of it like a flame in cupped hands, shielding it from wind, keeping it small and steady and private, until the moment arrived when it could be let out into the open. She had not accounted for Rolf. Rolf had always been, in the way of people who were accustomed to being at the center of things, curious about the edges. He had not thought much about Mara's desk in the immediate aftermath of the estate meeting, because there had been other, larger pieces of Bernard's estate to manage and profit from. But the estate took longer to settle than expected. Complications arose in the valuation of certain items, and in the course of one of these complications, Rolf ended up in conversation with the estate's lawyer, and in the course of that conversation, the lawyer mentioned, with professional blandness, that the walnut secretary desk, listed as a direct bequest to Mara Elissen, had been removed from the property by a professional moving company, a company that, when Rolf looked it up out of curiosity, specialized in the transport of high-value antiques. He called Mara on a Wednesday evening in February. "The movers," he said, not bothering with a greeting. "The ones who took the desk. They're not a residential company." "No," she said. A pause. "What's in the desk, Mara?" "A lot of compartments," she said. "It's a secretary desk. That's how they're built. You know what I mean." She did know what he meant. She also knew that what she had was hers, legally and completely, and that she owed him nothing, and that the time for the conversation they were about to have was not yet, and that the time for it would be when she chose it to be, and not before. "I'm having it appraised," she said, which was true. "Appraised for what?" "For its value as an antique," she said. "It's a very old piece. Bernard paid 600 francs for it in 1979. I'm curious what it's worth now." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him thinking, trying to determine whether to push and calculating what he had to gain from pushing before the appraisal was complete, versus what he might lose by alienating her before the full picture was available. Rolf's calculations were always audible in his silences. "Keep me posted," he said finally, and hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she called Dr. Marsh's office and left a message asking him to confirm the timeline for the final authentication report. He returned her call the next morning. The report, he told her, would be ready in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she thought. She could wait 6 weeks. She had waited 11 years. 6 weeks was nothing. Spring arrived early that year, the kind of early that feels like a promise the weather intends to keep. The girls noticed it first, Danny announcing one morning that the light looked different when she looked out her window, which was exactly right in the way that 7-year-olds are sometimes exactly right about things. Mara looked at the light and thought that it did look different. She thought a lot of things looked different lately. She was not sure if the world had changed, or if she had simply changed the angle from which she was looking at it. The final authentication report arrived in the first week of April. Dr. Marsh sent it by secure courier, a thick document in a bound cover bearing the letterhead of his firm, with the Geneva firm and the London legal team co-signed on the summary page. She sat down at the kitchen table in the evening after the girls were in bed and opened it. It ran to 47 pages. She read every one of them. The collection was confirmed as authentic and complete, meaning every item listed in the original 1944 documentation was present and accounted for. Nothing missing, nothing substituted. No, the provenance chain fully intact across 80 years of careful custody. The condition of the collection was described as exceptional, which Dr. Marsh had told her in their phone call was a word he used rarely and meant exactly what it said. The final valuation, arrived at through the combined methodology of 3 independent expert assessors, whose names and credentials filled 2 pages of the report's appendix, was stated as a range, as was standard practice for items of this nature. The lower end of the range was $294 million. The upper end was $312 million. She looked at those numbers for a long time. She thought about her uncle, who had found a desk with a hidden compartment at a French estate sale in 1979, son who had spent 27 years quietly and methodically determining what he had found, who had traveled to Geneva 14 months before his death to confirm that the vault was still active, who had written 4 careful pages and laid out a complete path through the complexity he knew was coming, who had chosen her name and waited. She thought about a family in Lyon who had loved beautiful things enough to hide them instead of surrendering them, who had sealed a collection in a vault and paid 80 years of fees forward because they believed that beauty outlasted catastrophe if you gave it enough time and enough careful protection, who had built documentation spread across multiple locations because they understood that the proof of ownership was as important as the thing itself. She thought about the Nautilus print on the staircase wall, every chamber numbered, and the single word beneath it: patience. She closed the report. She sat at the table in the quiet house, with the spring light fading outside the window and the clock on the wall marking the ordinary progression of an evening that was not, she thought, ordinary at all. She sat there for a long while, not thinking about what came next, just sitting with what had already happened, letting the weight of it settle into her bones. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Rolf, the 3rd this week, still waiting to hear about the appraisal. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she set the phone face down and went to check on her daughters. Petra was asleep on her side, one arm thrown out across the blanket in the particular abandon of someone who had stopped worrying about tomorrow. Mara stood in the doorway and looked at her. 11 years old. Old enough to have understood, for years now, that something was hard and that her mother was carrying it, and old enough to have never once made her mother feel judged for that, which was an act of grace in a child that Mara had never found words adequate to acknowledge. Danny was curled into a small, tight bundle, the way she always slept, the way she had slept since she was a baby, as though the world was something to be held close rather than spread out into. A stuffed rabbit sat on the pillow beside her. The rabbit had a name, Mara knew, but Danny changed its name periodically, which Danny said was because the rabbit was still figuring out who it was. Mara had thought about that more than once, figuring out who it is. She went back to the kitchen and sat down and picked up her phone and wrote a reply to Rolf that was 3 words long. It's very good. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went to bed. And for the first time in 11 years, she fell asleep without running the numbers. She already knew what they were. The phone call from Rolf came 6 days after she had sent those 3 words. It was a Saturday morning, early, the kind of call that arrives before the caller has thought carefully enough about the hour, which told her something about his state of mind. She was in the kitchen making breakfast for the girls when it rang. She looked at the screen, let it ring twice more, then answered. It's very good, he said, so repeating her words back to her with the particular edge of a man who had been sitting with a fragment of information long enough to become furious about how little of the whole picture it contained. That's all you said. It's very good. I'd like to know what that means, Mara. She turned the heat down on the stove and moved to the far end of the kitchen, keeping her voice even. It means the appraisal came back well. How well? She thought about Bernard's letter, about the instructions he had laid out, the careful path he had cleared, the professionals who were already managing the process with the thoroughness of people who had done this before. She thought about the fact that the legal transfer of the certificates and the formal sale process had been initiated the previous week through the London firm, and that the timeline was now in motion, and that nothing Rolf said or did in this phone call could change any of it. "Significantly well," she said. A long silence. She could hear him breathing, the controlled breathing of a man trying to decide how to approach a thing he couldn't see the full dimensions of. "Is there something we should discuss as a family?" She had thought about how she would answer this question, because she had known it was coming. She had thought about it carefully, not with bitterness, not with the sharp satisfaction of a person planning a reversal, but with the measured clarity of someone who had spent months learning the difference between what was hers and what belonged to other people. The desk was hers. The contents were hers. The months of work and the careful, patient handling of the process were hers. The outcome was hers. "No," she said, "there isn't." He started to respond, and she said, gently but with a finality that she had not known she possessed until she heard it in her own voice, "Rolf, Bernard left me a desk. That was his decision, made 14 months before he died, in full legal capacity, witnessed and documented. What was in the desk was also his, legally and completely, and it's now mine. If you have questions about the estate itself, the lawyer handled that. But the desk is a separate matter, and it's private." Another silence, this one different from the first. This one had the quality of a silence in which a person is revising their understanding of someone they thought they knew. "I see," he said finally, in a tone that communicated that he did not entirely see, but had recognized that pressing further was not going to produce what he wanted. "I hope you have a good weekend," she said, and ended the call. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, phone in hand, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, not the specific pleasure of having won a point against someone who had underestimated you, which she had imagined she might feel and now found she didn't want. What she felt was simpler than that. She felt clear. She felt like a person standing in a room that had been cluttered for years and has finally, after a long effort, found the floor again. Petra appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair tangled from sleep, and giving Mara the assessing look of an 11-year-old who has learned to read the atmosphere of a room before fully entering it. "Breakfast ready?" "Almost," Mara said, and turned the heat back up. The formal sale process took the remainder of spring and most of summer. The London firm handled the auction placement with the care and discretion that Bernard had specified in his instructions, which meant it was not announced broadly or listed in any public-facing catalog before the appropriate institutional buyers had been given the opportunity to evaluate and express interest. This was the standard approach for collections of this significance and this provenance, the lawyer in London explained to her during one of their regular calls, because the right buyers, the ones who would pay the right price, for were institutional collectors and museum acquisitions departments and private foundations with specific mandates, and they operated through private channels rather than public auction floors. She did not fully understand all of it. She was honest about that with the London lawyer, whose name was Ms. Adais Okonkwo, and who had, over the months of their collaboration, become someone Mara trusted in the specific way you trust a person who is exceedingly good at something you are not and who never makes you feel inadequate for the gap. Ms. Okonkwo explained what needed explaining, answered every question Mara asked without impatience, and was frank with her about the parts of the process that were straightforward and the parts that required judgment and would require Mara's sign-off. The preliminary offers began arriving in June. They came in the form of formal expressions of interest, carefully worded documents that committed to nothing but signaled the seriousness of the party behind them. Dr. Marsh walked her through each one. She read them at the kitchen table in the evenings, after the girls were in bed, learning a vocabulary she had not possessed 6 months earlier. learning the architecture of a market that operated according to its own logic, a logic that, once understood, was not so different from any other market, the intersection of rarity and desire, and the patient management of both. The first number that came in from a serious buyer was $240 million. Dr. Marsh told her it was not the final number. Miss Okonkwo told her it was not the final number. She had expected to feel something large and overwhelming when she saw it. Instead, she felt focused, the same quality of focus she brought to difficult problems at the billing office when the numbers didn't reconcile, and she had to go through the records line by line until she found the discrepancy. A problem to be worked correctly, a process to be followed with patience. The negotiation ran for 6 weeks. She did not rush it. She had been advised not to rush it, and she would not have rushed it anyway, because the lesson of the previous year had been sunk into her in a way that she expected would never fully leave. Patience was not a strategy she had adopted. It was something she had become. The final agreed price was $294 million. The number was the same as the lower bound on the authentication report, which Ms. Okonkwo told her was not a coincidence, but a function of the market aligning with the methodology, the market and the experts agreeing, the numbers validating each other across the distance between a sealed vault and a negotiating table. She thought about the 9-digit number she had first read in Bernard's handwriting on the certificate in that study above the old trees, and the fact that the world had confirmed it to the dollar, and she felt a kind of awe that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the precision of her uncle's understanding. The transfer completed on a Thursday in late August. The funds moved through the institutional accounts of the Geneva and London firms according to the schedule that had been established in the contract, arriving in the account she had opened for this purpose, and on an account that had been empty for years and was now something else entirely, in stages over the following 2 weeks, each stage accompanied by a confirmation document that she printed and filed in the same drawer as the girls' school records and the authentication report. When the final confirmation arrived, she sat down and did the math she had been doing in her head for months. She paid off the debt she had accumulated over 11 years. Not dramatically, not all at once in a single theatrical gesture, but methodically in the order of interest rate and urgency, the way you pay off debt when you have learned to respect the mathematics of it. The credit cards, the old medical bill that had been following her since Danny's birth, the informal loan from her neighbor, who received a check and a dinner and a look of complete astonishment and genuine happiness in roughly equal measure. She put aside, in dedicated accounts for each of them, enough to cover both girls' education entirely, undergraduate and graduate and whatever came after, without any condition attached, except that they pursue whatever it was they genuinely wanted to pursue, which was the only condition worth attaching to anything you gave a child. She set aside a sum for the things that had been deferred so long they had started to seem like other people's concerns. A house, not a rental, a house that belonged to her and the girls, that couldn't be taken back by a landlord who forgot to fix faucets, or a lease that expired at the wrong time. She had been looking at listings for 3 months already, quietly on her phone on the bus, the way people look at things they haven't yet given themselves permission to want. She knew roughly what she was looking for. Enough room, good light, a yard where Danny could leave things outside and come back to find them still there. She also put aside a sum for Bernard. Not for Bernard, literally, he was past needing anything, but for the things he would have approved of. She established a small grant in his name at the university library, where his correspondence files had gone, earmarked for research in the history of displaced cultural property, which felt like the right continuation of the work he had spent his life doing. She contacted the institution where his maritime charts had been sent and made a donation to their archival preservation program. These were not large gestures in proportion to what she now had, but they were the right ones, and they were hers to make. She did not call Rolf. She did not call Henrik or her Aunt Sina or any of the cousins who had been present at the estate meeting and had watched her name being read from the will with the expressions of people watching a mild, harmless mistake. She owed them no announcement and made none. The story would find its way to them in the way stories find their way, through the movements of information in a family that monitored itself the way her family monitored itself, through the lawyer, through public records, through the simple fact that a woman who had been arriving on 2 buses in damp shoes to stand at the back of rooms would soon be living differently, and people who had stood at the front of those rooms would notice. She was not interested in the noticing. She had thought, in the earlier months, that there might be a moment of confrontation she would want, a conversation in which the terms of the relationship were reset explicitly, in which the record was corrected and the casual dismissal of decades was acknowledged. She had imagined it occasionally, not with malice, but with the honest admission that she was human and had been looked at with contempt for a long time, and that contempt leaves marks. But the moment never arrived as an impulse she wanted to act on. What she found instead, as summer became autumn and the process concluded and the new reality of her life settled around her like a garment that fit correctly after years of wearing something that didn't, was that the vindication was not in the confrontation. It was in the life. It was in Petra's face when Mara sat down with her one evening and told her that things were going to change, and watched her daughter's expression move through confusion and disbelief and the particular emotion of a child who has been braced for difficulty for so long that the removal of it arrives not as joy, but as a fragile, careful relief, a hand unclenching slowly, afraid to fully open in case the thing it held disappeared again. It was in Donnie, who received the news that they were going to get a house with a yard by immediately asking whether they could get a dog, which was so perfectly Donnie, so entirely consistent with the 7-year-old logic that the next good thing was simply a platform for the next desired thing, that Mara laughed until she cried, which confused Danny considerably. And then Mara said yes, they could get a dog. See, and Danny's face became the face of someone for whom the universe has just resolved itself into perfect order. She told her neighbor on a Sunday afternoon over the dinner she had promised, a proper meal, the kind that takes most of a day to prepare and sits on the table with the comfortable weight of something made with full attention. Her neighbor, a woman named Grete, who had watched the girls and asked no questions, and expected nothing in return for years of quiet, uncomplicated kindness, received the news with the calm of a woman who had seen enough of life to be glad for other people's good fortune, without feeling diminished by it. She said only that she had always thought Mara was owed something by the universe, and was glad the universe had eventually gotten around to delivering it. Then she ate a second helping, and they talked about other things, the way people talk when a big thing has been said and received well, and there is nothing more it requires. The house came in October, almost exactly a year after the cold Tuesday morning, and the phone call she had almost not answered. It was in a neighborhood she had driven through once on a bus route, a quiet street with large trees that still held their leaves in the particular amber of a good October, a street where children moved between yards with the easy territorial confidence of children who have always lived somewhere safe. 3 bedrooms, a study she intended to use, and also to leave largely empty at first, the way you leave a room empty when you want to learn what it wants to be before you decide for it. A yard with an old apple tree that had not been properly tended in years, and that Mara intended to learn to tend, which was another form of the same patience she had been practicing her whole life, and had finally learned to recognize as a skill rather than simply a disposition. She moved the desk into the study. She had thought about that decision for a long time. She could have sold it. The desk itself, apart from what it had contained, was a documented piece by a documented maker and was worth considerably more than the 600 francs her uncle had paid for it at a French estate sale. But she found that she did not want to sell it. It was not sentiment exactly, or not only sentiment. It was something harder to name. The desk was the place where a chain of patients had been kept for 80 years. A family in Lyon had been patient enough to hide their collection and leave it protected. Bernard had been patient enough to find it and understand it and hold it until he could pass it correctly. She had been patient enough to come to a room and sit down and think before she reached. The desk was the object that all of that patience had traveled through, and it belonged in her house, in her study, where she sat in the evenings sometimes, with the lamp on and the street quiet outside and the girls asleep down the hall, and worked and thought and let the room become what it wanted to be. She thought often about the family in Lyon, about the people who had assembled that collection over 60 years, who had understood what they had and what was coming, and had hidden it with the conviction that beauty could wait, and that the right person would find it eventually, that patience was its own kind of preservation. She thought about what had become of them. The London firm had conducted a thorough investigation, as they were required to do as part of the authentication and sale process, and had found no surviving heirs, no documentation of the family's fate after 1944, beyond what could be inferred from records that were incomplete and terrible, in the way that records from that period were often incomplete and terrible. The collection's original owners were gone. The law was clear about what that meant for the disposition of the assets. The provenance was clean, and the title was hers. But she thought about them. She thought about the care it had taken to do what they had done, the clear-eyed understanding of what the world was capable of, and the refusal to surrender to it entirely, the insistence on leaving something beautiful intact, as if to say to the future, "We were here. We loved these things. Let this be the evidence." She made a donation to an organization that documented the history of cultural property lost during that period, and she made it in memory of a family in Lyon whose name she did not know and whose faces she would never see. It felt like the right thing to do with a portion of what they had protected. The autumn passed in the ordinary, extraordinary way that good autumns pass, filled with the small, specific details that accumulate into a life. The smell of the apple tree after rain, the particular quality of light through windows that belong to you. The dog, although a large and entirely undignified creature of mixed heritage, whom Donnie named, after considerable deliberation, Professor, for reasons she explained at length, and that Mara did not fully follow, but accepted with complete willingness. Petra started a new school that had a science program she had been wanting access to for 3 years, and the look on her face when she came home after the first week was the look of a person who has found the room where they belong, which was a look Mara intended to spend the rest of her life doing whatever it took to maintain. She left the billing office in November. She gave appropriate notice and received a card signed by her colleagues that she kept because it was kind, and because kindness deserved to be kept. She was not sure yet what came next in terms of work. She had ideas, and some specific and some still forming. She was not in a hurry. She had learned something important about not being in a hurry. She did hear from Rolf eventually, not a phone call this time, a letter, handwritten, which told her something about the register he was reaching for. He wrote that he had heard through the family that the desk had turned out to be more than it appeared, which was the formulation of a man choosing his words carefully around an admission he didn't want to make directly. He wrote that he wanted her to know there were no hard feelings, which was the formulation of a man who had feelings he wasn't acknowledging. He wrote that he hoped she and the girls were well. She read the letter twice. She thought about the contempt in the room when her name was called. She thought about the silence, and then the noise. She thought about the specific dismissal of poor Mara, who got the desk. She wrote back. The letter was short. She told him she and the girls were very well. She told him she hoped he was the same. She meant it, which surprised her only slightly. She did not hold a grievance. She did not want to hold a grievance. It was heavy, and it was in the way. She signed the letter, sealed it, and put it in the mailbox on the corner, and walked home in the October air under the amber trees of her street. And that was that. What people would say about Mara Elissen in the years that followed varied depending on who was saying it and what they needed the story to mean. Some would say she had been lucky, which was true in the sense that luck is always a component of any extraordinary outcome. The estate sale in France, the desk being left rather than destroyed, the vault standing intact for 80 years, the chain of chances connecting a woman in damp shoes to a sealed container in Geneva. Some would say she had been smart, which was also true, in the way that patience and attentiveness and the refusal to move before you understand what you're moving toward are forms of intelligence that don't always get recognized as such. But the people who knew her best, which was a small group and a chosen one, would say something different. They would say she had been ready, that the thing which had happened to her specifically because she was the person it needed to happen to, not in any mystical or fated sense, but in the practical sense that the process required someone who would do it correctly, who would sit in the chair and think, who would read all 4 pages of the letter and understand each one, who would make the calls and take the trips and follow the path without cutting corners, who would arrive at the end of it having handled every step with the same care that had been invested in building what she found. Bernard had known. He had written it in the letter with the same precision he brought to everything. He had chosen her because she was the one who would do it right. And she had. The desk sat in her study on a quiet street under old trees, in a house that belonged to her and her daughters, in a life that had been rebuilt from the ground, up by a woman who had learned the hard way that patience was not passive, was not simply waiting, was not the posture of someone with no options. Patience was active, and it was difficult, and it required everything. It required the daily decision to keep going, to keep your hands open, to keep believing that the right moment was coming, even when the evidence was thin, and the people around you were counting on your not being right. The faucet in the new house had never dripped. She noticed that in the first week, the simple, uncomplicated fact of a faucet that worked, and she let herself feel it fully rather than brushing past it, because small things deserved their acknowledgement, and she had spent too many years unable to afford them to be careless about them now. The lamp in the study burned late on certain evenings, the light visible from the street, a warm, steady glow in a window of a house where someone was working, thinking, "I'm building something with the time and the space and the resources that had been waiting in a hidden compartment for the right person to find them." Her mother, she thought, would have laughed. The real laugh, the one that was a little too loud for polite company, the one that arrived without warning and filled a room like something escaped from somewhere wonderful. She would have laughed, and then she would have cried, and then she would have said something that landed exactly right. Some specific, particular thing that her daughter would have held for the rest of her life. Mara did not know what that thing would have been, but she thought about it sometimes, sitting at the desk in the quiet study with the lamp on and the street outside and the girls asleep down the hall. The desk that had crossed an ocean and held a secret and waited patiently for the moment to give it up. She thought about it, and she smiled, and she kept working. Because that was what you did when someone had believed in you enough to leave you a locked room full of possibility. You opened it carefully. You understood what you had. And then you built something worthy of the patience that had preserved it for you. That is the story of Mara Elissen, and the desk, and the hidden drawer that nobody else thought to look for, in a house on a hill full of things most people saw as worthless because they didn't know how to measure the right kind of value. In a family full of people who looked past her because they didn't understand what quiet and steady and patient actually cost, or what it was worth when it finally arrived at the right moment with its hands full of everything the world had tried to keep from it. Some doors don't have obvious handles. Some locks don't have obvious keys. Some fortunes don't announce themselves. They wait. They wait in hidden compartments, in old walnut desks bought for 600 francs at an estate sale in France in 1979, in sealed vaults in Geneva, maintained by 80 years of prepaid fees, in letters written in careful handwriting by solitary men who loved their nieces more than they ever managed to say out loud while they were alive to say it. They wait for the person who comes into the room and sits down first. They wait for the person who thinks before they reach. They have been waiting all along. There is a particular kind of mourning that belongs only to people who have come through something. Not the mourning after a celebration, which carries its own brightness, loud and obvious. This is quieter than that. It is the mourning after the last piece of something long and difficult has finally settled into place, when the body wakes before the alarm, and the first thought is not a worry, but a fact, solid and real. And the fact is simply, it is done, and I am here, and the day ahead belongs to me. Mara had that morning in November, 3 weeks after the final transfer had cleared, and the last confirmation document had been filed in the drawer with the girls' school records. She woke at 5:40, before the alarm, before the house had stirred, and lay still for a moment in the bedroom of a house that was hers, listening to the particular silence of a place that knows it is yours. It was different from the silence of a rental. A rental's silence always held a faint reservation, a quality of temporary occupation, of space on loan. This silence was unconditioned. It had nowhere else to be. She got up and went downstairs in her socks and made coffee. Real coffee, from the proper machine she had allowed herself to buy, without a single calculation about whether she could justify it. She stood at the kitchen window with the mug in both hands and looked at the yard, still dark at that hour, the apple tree a shape against the lighter dark of the sky. Professor, the dog, appeared from whatever corner of the house he had claimed for the night, and sat beside her feet and looked at the yard too, with the companionable seriousness of a creature who takes the monitoring of early morning yards very seriously. She thought, this is a Tuesday, not a special Tuesday, not a Tuesday with an appointment or a deadline or a confirmation call scheduled. Just a Tuesday in November with good coffee and a yard and a dog and 2 daughters still asleep down the hall and a drawer full of documents that represented the conclusion of a chain of patience stretching back 80 years to a family in Lyon who had loved beautiful things enough to protect them from everything the world could throw. She thought about all the Tuesdays that had come before this one, the ones that had begun with cold coffee and a dripping faucet, and the weight of running the numbers before she was fully awake. She did not dwell on them with bitterness. They were part of the same story. You could not fully appreciate the unconditioned silence of a house that was yours if you had not spent years in the conditional silence of one that wasn't. The difficulty had not been wasted. It had been building something, quietly and without her permission, something she might not have had if it had been easier. She did not romanticize that. The difficulty had also been hard in ways that had cost her, cost the girls, cost years of the kind of ease that children deserve and that she had not been able to provide. She did not pretend otherwise. But she held both things at once, the cost and the building, the loss and what remained, and found that she could, which was itself something she had learned in the long middle of the story, that the capacity to hold difficult things simultaneously without resolving them into something simpler was not a weakness, but the specific kind of strength that made it possible to keep going. Professor put his head on her foot. She looked down at him. "Good morning," she said. He wagged once, solemnly, and looked back at the yard. She had a meeting that week with a woman named Harriet Voss, who ran a small foundation that provided educational support to children in households navigating financial instability. Harriet had been recommended by Ms. Okonkwo in London, who had mentioned her in passing as someone doing careful and specific work in a field crowded with organizations doing broad and imprecise work. Mara had called Harriet in September, and they had spoken for an hour, feeling each other out in the way that two practical women feel each other out, directly and without much preamble, discovering in the process that they shared an understanding of what it meant to be short on resources and long on necessity, and what the difference between the two kinds of help actually looked like from the inside of the situation rather than the outside. She was not yet sure what form her involvement with Harriet's foundation would take. She had ideas, some specific and some still forming, but she had learned to leave ideas room to develop into their correct shape, rather than pressing them into a form that was convenient before they were ready. What she knew was that a portion of what she had was going toward work of this kind, toward the specific and practical reduction of the kind of difficulty she knew from the inside, and that she wanted to do it in a way that was useful rather than simply generous, which were not the same thing and were frequently confused. She thought about Bernard, about the grant in his name at the university library, about the way he had spent his life doing work that most people didn't understand, building knowledge that wouldn't become useful until the right person came along to apply it. She thought about the patience that required, the willingness to work without immediate legibility, to trust that what you were building would matter even if you couldn't see exactly how or when or to whom. She thought she understood him better now than she had when he was alive. She regretted that she hadn't tried harder then, and accepted the regret as a fact rather than a wound. He had known her better than she had known him, which was the kind of asymmetry that sometimes exists between people across a generation, the older person seeing further into the younger one than the younger one can yet see into themselves. He had seen her patience before she had fully understood it as a quality rather than simply a circumstance. She intended to earn the clarity of his vision. In December, she had an unexpected phone call from Henrik. Not Rolf this time, Henrik, whom she had always found less calculating than his brother, and more genuinely curious, though the curiosity had not, at the estate meeting, translated into any particular warmth toward her. He called on a Sunday afternoon and introduced himself as though she might not remember him, which told her something about his own uncertainty entering the conversation. He said he wanted to tell her something. She waited. He said that he thought Bernard had been right. He said it simply, without elaboration, without qualification, and the simplicity of it was the thing that made it land. Not I can see now that in retrospect or circumstances have clarified, but simply, Bernard was right. He knew you were the one. She was standing in the study when he said this, beside the desk, one hand resting on the dark walnut of its surface. She felt the cool smoothness under her palm. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." "I imagine it does," he said, and she heard in his voice that he meant it without agenda, that it was simply a man telling a truth he had arrived at on his own and wanted to deliver. "I'm glad it worked out the way it did." They spoke for a few minutes more about nothing in particular, sort of the kind of conversation that exists to establish that a door is open, rather than to walk very far through it. When they ended the call, she stood for a moment with the phone in her hand, looking at the desk, and thought about the difference between people who cannot admit they were wrong and people who can, and the specific rarity of the second kind. She thought that Bernard, who had been a careful student of human nature, despite his preference for objects over people, had probably known the difference too. She set the phone down on the desk's green leather surface and looked at the room. The study had become what it wanted to be. She had left it deliberately sparse for the first weeks, waiting to learn its character before imposing one. And what she had found was that it wanted to be a working room, not a display room, not a room organized around its most impressive object, but a room where thinking happened, where paper spread across a surface meant that someone was in the middle of something, where the lamp burned late because the work required it, and the work was worth requiring it. There were books on one shelf, not many yet, accumulating slowly as she found the ones that belonged there, rather than filling the shelf quickly for the appearance of it. There was a small framed photograph of her mother on the wall beside the window, a photograph she had found in a box that had been in storage for years. Her mother mid-laugh, the laugh Bernard had described in the letter, a little too loud for polite company, arriving without warning, filling the frame with something escaped from somewhere wonderful, and she had been looking for exactly that photograph for years, and had found it only after she had a room worthy of putting it in, which felt like the kind of timing that meant something even if you couldn't quite say what. The desk sat where it had always sat, beneath the window, patient and permanent, built by hands that had known they were building for a century. She sat at it most evenings. She had begun writing at it, nothing intended for anyone else's eyes yet, just the practice of putting things down in the specific clarity that came from sitting in a chair, with the lamp on and the street quiet, and no emergency requiring her attention. She had not written since she was young, since before the marriage, and the dissolution of the marriage, and the long middle that followed. She had not permitted herself the luxury of it. Now she permitted herself the luxury, and found that it was not a luxury at all, but something more like breathing, necessary and self-replenishing, the kind of activity that gave back more than it took. She did not know what it would become. She was in no hurry to find out. The apple tree in the yard had lost its leaves by December, standing in the spare dignity of a tree that has learned to wait out the cold. She had looked up its variety in the early weeks and found it was older than she had assumed, perhaps 40 years, certainly predating the previous owners, a tree that had been there through several versions of this yard and this house and had continued fruiting regardless, which was its own kind of argument for patience. She had found a person who knew about fruit trees, a retired gardener named Mr. Oxio, whose number she had been given by a neighbor, and he had come and looked at it and told her what it needed, which turned out to be less than she feared and more attentive than she had been. She had started learning. She expected the learning to take several seasons and was prepared to give it several seasons. Petra had, by December, become a person who came home from school talking about experiments, which was a change so marked from the previous year's version of coming home that Mara sometimes simply sat and listened to it, with the full, unhurried attention of someone receiving something they had wanted for a very long time. The science program had given her a project group, 3 other students with the same quality of focused enthusiasm that Petra had been carrying alone and directing at whatever was available, which had made her seem intense in a context that didn't know what to do with that intensity. In the right context, the intensity looked like exactly what it was, exactly what Mara had always known it was. Danny had, by December, taught Professor 17 commands, 11 of which he reliably obeyed, 4 of which he obeyed selectively depending on what else was happening, and 2 of which he appeared to have decided were suggestions rather than instructions. She had documented this in a notebook, with careful headings, and a hand-drawn chart, which she presented to Mara one evening with the gravity of a scientist presenting findings. Mara reviewed it with equivalent gravity and suggested that the 2 unreliable commands might benefit from a revised training approach, which Danny received as the expert feedback she had come looking for and immediately began acting on. Professor sat through the presentation with his head tilted at an angle that suggested He was aware he was being discussed and had opinions about the characterization. This was the life. This was what the desk had made possible. Not the desk exactly, not the fortune exactly, but the space that the fortune had cleared, the room it had made for the life that had always been there waiting, that had been present in Petra's intensity and Danny's notebooks and the lamp burning late and the apple tree in the yard, waiting for enough room to become fully itself. On the last evening of the year, she sat at the desk after the girls were in bed, with the lamp on and the street outside draped in the particular quiet of a city holding its breath between one year and the next. She had a glass of wine, something she had chosen carefully from a small shop she had discovered 3 streets over. A shop run by a man who asked you 2 questions about what you liked, and then handed you exactly the right bottle with the confidence of someone who had been paying attention to his subject for a long time. She sat with the wine and the lamp and the quiet and looked at the room. She thought about all of it, the chain of it. A workshop in Paris in the 1880s where a craftsman had built a desk with a hidden space inside it, some private ingenuity or habit of concealment built into his work, or as a family in Lyon who had assembled something extraordinary and hidden the proof of it inside that space in 1943. The last act of people who understood exactly what was coming and chose to protect what they loved rather than surrender it. A man at an estate sale in France in 1979 with a pair of calipers in his coat pocket who had noticed the mathematics didn't add up. 27 years of patient investigation. A letter written in careful handwriting and sealed in an archival sleeve. A cold Tuesday morning in October, and a phone call she had almost not answered. All of it connecting to this room, this lamp, this glass of wine, these 2 daughters asleep down the hall, this dog at her feet, this house that was hers, this life that had found its correct shape at last. She raised the glass slightly, a private gesture, toward no one in particular, or toward everyone who deserved it. The craftsman, the family in Lyon, Bernard, her mother, all the patient people in the chain who had held things carefully until the right moment arrived. Then she set it down and pulled a fresh page toward her across the green leather of the desk's surface and picked up her pen and began. Outside, the old year ended and the new one began. Unhurried and unceremonious, the way the best things always do, without announcement, without spectacle, simply arriving as it had always been going to, exactly when it was supposed to. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.